Welcome now to our 7th session as we look at what? Well, in general philosophy, the word, if you break it in half, is the love of, philos, and Sophia, wisdom. And we think of the ancient Greeks, those thinkers, and sometimes we're turned off because thinking takes work. But in reality, the Greeks were incredibly wise in their own way. Many of them, not knowing any of the background in the Bible, came to believe there must be a God, just through logic. And I have many friends who are thinkers who came to find the God of the Bible and trust the Bible as God's book for us because of philosophy. Philosophy is like the foundational principle on which everything else is built as you deal with the reality around you. And it is important. And so philosophy itself, when it comes to religion, when it comes to reality, when it comes to the Bible especially, they come up against what we often call the problem of evil. And we look at that understanding that as you read Job, you have read one of the most classic books of antiquity, and I want to say one of the most influential books in the world surrounding this very problem. And Psalms is attached to this. As you will see, the problem of evil has two sides to it, and Psalms deals with a second, more personal side. It's practical in this sense. We need both. And before we look at the two sides and begin diving in, I just want to deal with you about the question that often comes up when you read, as our reading begins with Job. Is this a literal, real account? I mean, after all, Satan's showing up in heaven, and how do we get that? How could human beings even capture that kind of history? They weren't around. They couldn't reach up to heaven. It's kind of like the book of Genesis. How could humans write about the creation story before humans existed? You know? And how can we trust this as anything other than a good divine drama, and maybe actually just a myth that people wrestled together over generations and redacted and came up with this wonderful story to tell their children why evil exists? Well, here's my answer. Jesus referred to Job as a real person, as did his followers, the other authors of the New Testament and those in the Old Testament. And this idea of it being a literal account, we have Satan, who's described in the Bible as a fallen angel. In the book of Ezekiel, we see him as this great cherub who fell because he was seeking the glory of God. For himself, he wanted to become like God. And this literal personage of Satan, or the person of Job, I believe they're historical figures. I believe this book is more than just a good story packaging truth. And if you take it this way for our topic today, the problem of evil, it still works, okay? I'm not saying you won't get anything out of this. You'll get the whole kit and caboodle when you understand what it's teaching. But when you deal with the Bible as a whole, you must be careful not to immediately buy into the assumption that becomes ours naturally as humans, that it must just be mythology, or it must not be historical and something that actually happened. Why buy into that when, now here's what I want you to think about. When you look at Satan in heaven, or the creation before humans were existent, who was there? The God who lives in heaven and who lives outside of time. This God is the author of this book. He simply used humans as its instruments to put the words on the page. So it's very practical, logical, and possible that Job is a real person, exactly as Jesus and his followers seem to teach it. But let's now get into the actual account and the basic argument. You may know this idea that if this God of the Bible, as he's portrayed, is all-powerful, everywhere present, and all-loving, then why evil? Why do I experience hardships in my life? Why do you encounter suffering in ones you love and you experience it yourself? I mean, when you're all powerful and everywhere present, you have control of everything, right? If you're all good, why the bad? Very good question. And Job was given to us, as were the Psalms in large measure, to help us find understanding. Can I say to you that the Bible and books like Job and the Psalms give us the best logical, practical, and spiritual answer to touch our hearts and our heads and to give us understanding that there is a solution to what seems on the surface to be a problem. So when you look at the desk of your mind, thinking about all that you've read, and you come to this problem of evil, and you come to the book of Job, it's often said, and this is what you encounter, is you follow the storyline, it seems to have a big blank. It seems as though when finally God shows up, he doesn't answer Job's question as to why the evil. He seems to be silent about that. And there's maybe a space on your desk. You're saying, now God, let's fill in the answers. What you're going to see is the book of Job fills it in. It's like all the other areas of question and comment and points of interest all get shuffled over to fill in the gap because the answers aren't necessarily found right at the end. We as Westerners read books that way, but this is a Middle Eastern story, isn't it? And stories in the Eastern mind have their climax more in the midpoint, as you will see. Now, the way I'd like to take this forward is to look with you at a very brief video of one of the philosophers today, a Christian philosopher. And William Lane Craig, as we watch this, a little snippet of a video in which he is debating in front of a live audience of students. He's debating one of the new atheists of our day, who's not present anymore in this world, Christopher Hitchens.
What do you think about Epicurus' argument that if God is omnibenevolent, omniscient, and omnipotent, if he knows about kids in Africa and that are born with AIDS, what do you think about him suggesting, him not intervening and him not changing that fact? That's a question that I've always struggled with. So I'm just wondering, could you expand on that, and I'd also like your input on it?
The problem of evil and suffering has been greatly discussed by philosophers, and I think there's been genuine progress made in this century on this problem. I think it's important to distinguish between the intellectual problem of suffering and the emotional problem of suffering, because these are quite different from each other. In terms of the intellectual problem of suffering, I think that there you need to ask yourself, is the atheist claiming, as Epicurus did, that the existence of God is logically incompatible with the evil and suffering in the world? If that's what the atheist is claiming, then he's got to be presupposing some kind of hidden assumptions that would bring out that contradiction and make it explicit, because these statements are not explicitly contradictory. The problem is no philosopher in the history of the world has ever been able to identify what those hidden assumptions would be that would bring out the contradiction and make it explicit. On the contrary, you can actually prove that these are logically compatible with each other by adding a third proposition, namely, that God has morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil in the world. As long as that statement is even possibly true, it proves that there's no logical incompatibility between God and the suffering in the world. So the atheist would have to show that it is logically impossible for God to have morally sufficient reasons for permitting the evil and suffering in the world, and no atheist has ever been able to do that. So the logical version of this problem, I think, is widely recognized to have failed. Now, I recognize that that philosophical response to the question doesn't deal with the emotional problem of evil. And I think for most people, this isn't really a philosophical problem. It's an emotional problem. They just don't like a God who would permit suffering and pain in the world. And so they turn their backs on him. What does Christianity have to say to this problem? Well, I think it has a lot to say. It tells us that God is not some sort of an impersonal ground of being or an indifferent tyrant who folds his arms and watches the world suffer. Rather, he is a God who enters into human history in the person of Jesus Christ. And what does he do? He suffers. On the cross, Christ bore a suffering of which we can form no conception. Even though he was innocent, he bore the penalty of the sins of the whole world. None of us can comprehend what he suffered. And I think when we contemplate the cross of Christ and his love for us and what he was willing to undergo for us, It puts the problem of suffering in an entirely different perspective. It means, I think, that we can bear the suffering that God calls upon us to endure in this life with courage and with optimism for an eternal life of unending joy beyond the grave because of what Christ has done for us. And He will give us, I think, the courage and the strength to get through the suffering that God calls upon us to bear in this life. So whether it's an emotional issue or an intellectual issue, I think ultimately Christian theism can make sense out of the suffering and evil in the world.
Okay, so Dr. Craig made a point. There's the intellectual side of this problem of evil and the emotional side. You might say it influences not only our heads, but our hearts. And how beautiful that in our reading today, and through this week really, we saw the head portion, the arguments with Job and his friends in the presence of God, and the heart portion through the writings of the psalmist, especially King David. And so we look at both, and it's essential, isn't it? You know how it is. You can win a good argument and lose a friend. But when people know that you care for them, they're willing to listen to the abstract ideas you have that might also help them out. And so as we press forward in these two areas, let's start with Job. As you look at the book, you see the opening account of Job as being a very righteous man. And not only is he choosing the right things, he chooses to care for his children so much that he's offering sacrifice for them day after day. It's like if you have children and you pray for them every day for their blessing. We make choices, don't we? Imagine if your children were forced into a closet and you told them, you're going to do everything I want or never come out. You just die there. They wouldn't love you very much, would they? Imagine if God made us and said, but you have no freedom whatsoever. The first point to be made when we think about God and the problem of evil is we need to look at the fact that human beings are moral beings. It's not just this, but also the angels. Even as Job was making choices, we come in chapter 1 to see Satan, who approaches God and challenges him. Look at the text. One day the angels came, it says, to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan also came with them. The Lord said to Satan, where have you come from? He said, from roaming throughout the earth, going back and forth in it. After the Lord asks, have you noticed how upright Job is? Satan brings the challenge, which goes in two levels over 2 chapters. But again, this angel, we understand, had a choice. He was once a high reigning angel, an archangel, living in heaven, enjoying all the bliss that God makes possible to those who choose to follow his ways. And Satan chose to go his own way, a moral agent. And so when we come to the problem of evil and we say, why and how, God, do you realize we're exercising the free choice to ask such a question? Do you wish to lose the ability to make choices yourself? Because that's what you're asking for when you insist that evil will just disappear. It's not a part of a reality, is it? But let's go another level. Dr. Craig brought out the fact that Epicurus, that ancient Greek philosopher, said if God is everywhere present and all-powerful and also fully loving, that is all good. Why the evil? Well, hold on a minute. You get these notions about God from the Bible. This is the Christian view of God. If this is your point of argument, that he's both all-powerful and all good, have you forgotten where you got your arguments from? The Bible is a foundation for those two premises, and Craig makes the point, let's add a third that comes from the Bible. God makes moral choices to do that which, or to use evil in a way which promotes good. And you can't really argue against that because you first use the Bible to argue against God. So look at the whole Bible in its context, and it shows you a God who does use evil for good, not just to help grow our characters, but it shows us that evil itself can push us to trust in God. Maybe you've had that experience where hardship has caused you to turn to God in prayer. Now, I know it can go the other way, and that's when these are the kind of times in your life when maybe you want to look at a book like Job to ponder, why did I turn away because of the hardship? Maybe he allowed that to help me grow and turn closer to him. The Bible, in fact, describes a time in which the whole earth will be filled with evil near the end of time. And I believe personally, and I see scripture to support this in general, that God will use this to help every last possible person turn to him. That's you and that's me. And so maybe God has a good purpose for evil. But as we look at Job and we see God and Satan almost dueling, we have this other question. Why, God, did you let evil exist in the first place? Because we have this notion that if God is everywhere, that evil should be nowhere. Why does it exist? And what happens is we get to the idea that maybe God doesn't therefore exist. Do you ever go there in your mind? It's an easy place to go. If there's evil, well, there must not be an all-powerful, all-good God. And so let's look at this third point. How do you know evil is evil? The same way you know how darkness is really dark. You recognize darkness because you see light. You know evil because of that which is good. And against the argument that there is no God because of evil comes the stronger argument that overlays it, the argument of the goodness of God. The morality that is imprinted on the minds of human beings. The evolutionist might say, everything in the world exists because it just evolved. We don't know how it started, don't know how life started, we can't get there really, but things evolved after that, right? And after all, even our moral principles might have evolved through the survival of the fittest. And what happens if it's all about survival? We want to dominate and no one else should win over us. Then where did that idea come from? That civility is a good thing. And that our heroes are those who conquer evil with good. Why is that on our minds? Why do we sometimes choose to sacrifice ourselves for the sake of others? Is this merely coming through a process of evolution? Well, many believe the moral principle, the conscience that seems to be impressed on humanity is an evidence of a greater conscience coming from God. That we wouldn't recognize darkness if there weren't light. We wouldn't recognize evil if there were not goodness in which to contrast and compare it. And so when you see Job and God battling it out, it doesn't mean Satan has a right to overcome God, but that God allowed Satan to exist for a time, and evil itself, to encourage free moral agents to turn to him, the source of all goodness. So as we go on to this whole problem of evil, we find ourselves not just in Job, but the whole Bible proclaiming there is a God and you can trust him. But the disciples came up once to, and I give this as an example of the many biblical stories and truths. In John chapter 9, they came up and said, Lord, look at this man. He's blind. He was clearly born this way. Why? Who sinned, this man or his parents, to cause this blindness? Now, we tend to think that way today. If there is a God, and if people have trouble, it must be they turn from God. And look at the Lord's answer. It was neither this man nor his parents that sinned, but this happened so that the works of God might be displayed in him. I bring this out because the narrative and the story of Job goes from the initial problem of Satan and evil being inflicted to the friends who come. At first, they spend a whole week to comfort and console. But after a while, they kind of get tired on that track and decide to confront. Once Job opened his mouth and challenged God and spoke from his heart and said, I don't understand it, and Lord, help me out because I'm just mad. I'm dying here in pain, but you won't let me die. And the friends say, Job, shut your mouth. You're sinning. And it's your own sin that caused the problem. And you might notice as you read through this account, so beautifully written, notice it's poetry. And we have now entered with Job in the first of 5 books, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon. These books of what? Poetry. And Hebrew poetry, like much poetry today, is written to get us to think. So the disciples are also being challenged to think. Is it simply, as Job's friends came to conclude, Job's sin that caused the suffering? Is that the reason, if there is a God, for suffering in your life and mine? The Bible gives us a better picture. It shows us a God who's above all things, who in love will use all for good if we simply trust Him. Now, this is what I really want you to see, is the book of Job takes us on a journey. And I mentioned last week that the whole of the Bible, and really the lives in which we live, are based on this progressive purpose of God. And so as we look at the book of Job, we see right in the heart of it, right in the middle, Job comes to a decision, a conclusion. He says, and I'm quoting now from Job 19, verses 25 and 26. I love these verses. I know, he says, that my Redeemer lives. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. Now, where did he get this wisdom? To believe in a life after this life and in a Redeemer who would make it all good in the end? This, as I've been saying from the start, the major theme of the whole Bible. It's the river on which all the revelation flows. And one of the tributaries is dealing with our thought life, in dealing with the greatest challenge, the problem of suffering and evil that's around us and that plagues us every day. God's promise as a Redeemer is to use it all for good. And Job captured that promise, not just in his hands, but in his heart. It eventually affected the way he thought about things, but it often, I want to say to you, redemption begins often in the heart. The problem of evil, as Dr. Craig said, isn't usually just intellectual. It's also very personal and practical. Maybe you've been hurt. Maybe not afflicted to the level of Job. And that's why we have this great book. You can say to yourself, there's always someone who suffered more than I have. But there's a God who means to use it for good. That's what redemption is. He paid a price to make good on it. Look at the linear progression in the Bible. Job was foreseeing it prophetically. There would come one day, though sin fell into the world and problems erupted everywhere. And Job, one of the most ancient books in all the Bible with Genesis, begins immediately to deal with the problem and point forward with Genesis to a coming solution. Christ came to live among us, and not just to point to the blind man and heal him, but to open our eyes to the fact that God does love us. I don't know about you, but when I encounter loved ones and dear friends who struggle with pain and suffering and say, why God? I tell them it's okay to ask the question, why? Because there's a God who came to give an answer. The answer is, I love you. Jesus said, when they asked how much, he said this much as he put his hands out, stretched them out to die on a cross for us. And there's your answer. God came to the world to say, I will eradicate evil once and for all, but right now I give you a solution. I meet you as I met Job, and I care for you, and I suffer with you. And Christ on the cross, in fact, took all the suffering upon himself that we deserve, so that we could enter glory. That's the beauty. The Bible moves us to this progression where there's a final solution, and we can rejoice with Job in the hope of what is yet to come. When you see this progression, then what happens? You find also answer in the book of Psalms. If Job found, as things moved along at the end, he was doubly blessed with more children, more animals, and so forth. And Christ promised, if you suffer in this world as my child, you'll have many times blessing in this world and multiple times blessings in the world to come. You need to hear this in your heart. And so perhaps you come to the book of Psalms and you go to a favorite after David deals a lot with evil. The book of the Psalms is really us seeing a man of God open his heart to God with the full expression. It's not just a book of praise, but of complaint, isn't it? It's a book that even shows David with a vengeful spirit. And we say, how can you do that, David? And God says, why don't you do that, my beloved son or daughter? When you learn to complain to me and talk to me from your heart, I can begin to heal you and also give you understanding for your mind. And from Psalm 23, when you cry out to God and He leads you through the valley of suffering and evil, and you find victory because you learn to trust Him with your emotions. And then you go back a step to Psalm 22, and there you find a description of the cross and a reminder in the Psalms, once again, that there is a solution to the problem of evil. It's more than intellectual, it's personal. Not just for us, but for God. He truly loves us. And I don't mean to oversimplify this problem. I know this is just a quick, simple mention of a few things to consider, but I do mean to point you to our God, hoping you can say with me one day, and maybe now, because you come to trust Him as you read the Word, I know that there is a Redeemer. He's alive. He rose from the dead. And one day I'm going to see Him also. I'll be there with Job and with all those from that time on, and we're all together, and there is no more evil. We will know once and for all and forever that our God reigns and He has all the solutions.